There is a birthday we really should have celebrated a couple weeks ago. One that probably went unnoticed by most people, because this birthday was May 27th, 1819. In New York City, Julia Ward Howe was born. Now, if you've ever wondered, what is it that I can do to make a positive difference in the world? Or how can I put my beliefs into action to make the world a better place? And I want to tell you about Julia in a moment. In a time like this, when in so many ways our culture appears to be divided into political factions and social tribes that just can't seem to find any common ground, and it is easy to be more than a little despondent and fearful about what the future holds, I think that it's helpful to remember that history so often repeats itself. I love the quote by William Faulkner. He said, "The past is never dead. It's not even the past." It's a harsh fact that we have terribly short memories, that we don't learn from our mistakes, and people often behave in self-destructive ways, sometimes in large groups. But the bright side of that reality is that as bad and as depressing as things seem to be, there are people, perfectly average, everyday people, who have found ways to rise above and overcome problems that appear to be unsolvable. There are cycles running through history when issues that looked simply insurmountable were overcome by people who are motivated by their faith, their religious faith for sure, but also their faith in each other and their faith in the common good. Love your neighbor as yourself is definitely something Jesus once said, but it certainly works no matter who said it. So the cycle of history is that while bad things indeed happen, the human story is just loaded with people whose hope-filled beliefs inspired them to act in ways that make a positive and lasting difference. One consistent pattern is that in their time, most of these agents of change were considered to be off the wall or just plain crazy. Not because they were suffering from any mental health issues, but because what they were advocating was just so aspirational and so visionary. The common wisdom at the time was, this will never work. It's far too radical. It's naive. It's a waste of time and energy. There are always going to be plenty of naysayers. The thing is, naysayers never make history. They just observe events and critique them before they eventually slip into obscurity. It's those people the naysayers call crazy. Those are the ones whom we remember. And today I'd like to take us back in time to a particular person who is considered crazy by very many, but who I think can serve as an example of a very good kind of crazy. So if you're worried about the way things are today and wondering, is it crazy? Is it too naive to hope for peace and common sense and people working together to make good things happen? We can look to Julia Ward Howe to serve as an inspiration. Because Julia used her faith and used the power of her words, and with the help of her friends, she not only helped end slavery in America, she advanced the rights of women, rights that most people today just simply take for granted. So let me tell you about her. She was the daughter of a wealthy banker and a stockbroker. She grew up privileged, educated by private tutors. She was smart, whip smart, and outspoken. She became very well read, and her social circle was elite and intellectual. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a good friend of hers. Now, she grew up Episcopalian, but as an adult in the Unitarian Church, which was on the forefront of social change and civil rights. In 1843, Julia married a prominent Boston doctor, reformer, and abolitionist whose name was Samuel Howe. Together they had 6 children, and Julia wrote plays and essays for leading magazines, and she published poetry. And she sometimes wrote anonymously because in that day and time, it just wasn't considered proper always for a woman of her social standing to be engaged in the tawdry world of journalism and literature. Sadly, her marriage to Samuel became strained. He was progressive in a lot of ways, but he still believed that a woman's role in life was to stay at home, raise children, and not stir up any controversy. He was especially troubled because many times Julia's writings were critiques of women's traditional roles and their place in society, and even critiques of her very own marriage and her husband's philandering. So, to no one's surprise, they were separated in 1852. Now, there was a literary contemporary of Julia's, and her name you probably know, Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1801, Harriet wrote the groundbreaking, best-selling novel exposing the evils of slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So for women like Julia Ward Howe and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the cause of the abolition movement and the abolition of slavery and the cause of women's rights became closely intertwined. In 1861, during the first year of the American Civil War, it was painfully obvious that things were just not going well for the Union, that the effort to end slavery and reunite the country would indeed be a long and bloody conflict. And that's when Julia met with Abraham Lincoln at the White House. Now, during the Civil War, Julia began working for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which promoted clean and hygienic conditions for soldiers and hospitals. And in that role, she saw the horrors of the war firsthand. And she also saw how quickly soldiers and politicians were beginning to turn away from the belief that this war could even be won. Early on, not everyone on the Union side understood the Civil War as an effort to end slavery. Julia, though, not only understood it as such, she knew that the abolition of slavery was a moral, ethical crusade, that the Union Army was fighting not just to reunite the country, but to correct a fundamental flaw in the larger picture of how we regard each other as human beings. So during that visit she made to Washington when she met Lincoln, Julia was encouraged to write brand new lyrics to a popular tune that was already well known to soldiers both in the North and South. She did, and it was first published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in February 1862. You've probably heard this before, and it goes like this.
The glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful deep of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
I was hoping you guys would do that. The impact of the Battle Hymn of the Republic was gigantic. It not only became the favorite marching song of the Union Army, it helped frame the war as a moral and holy crusade. It just had this galvanizing effect. No longer was the war merely a fight to preserve the political preservation of the Union. It now served a higher and nobler purpose. After the war, Julia shifted her energies to establishing and leading major women's organizations. So she championed voting rights for women by founding suffrage associations in New England. Those groups became part of a larger group called the National Women's Suffrage Association. That organization, though, in 1870 became bitterly divided over the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Civil War put an end to slavery, but giving those former slaves the right to vote, that was another issue entirely. The 15th Amendment sought to guarantee that right. At the very same time, women's suffrage groups were advocating for the right for women to have the right to vote. It's hard for us to believe today, but in the mid 19th century America, those were both very radical ideas. People thought they were crazy. So the 15th Amendment became a compromise. It promised voting rights for African American men, but not for women. The hard political truth was, if the 15th Amendment included rights for slaves and men, it had a snowflake's chance of ever becoming law. So Julia supported the 15th Amendment, believing that any voting rights for African Americans was better than none at all. But there was an opposing group led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they opposed any amendment that did not also include voting rights for women. Julia agreed with them in principle, but disagreed with strategy. She understood that at that time in history, the amendment had no chance of passage if it included women's voting rights. Now, that didn't mean that she stopped working for that right. It just meant, let's get done now what we can get done now. So she joined Lucy Stone in founding the American Women's Suffrage Association, which championed the 15th, and it did become law in 1870. And Julia established that group's newspaper called the Women's Journal, had a subsequent name in the 20th century, which she edited for 20 years, not only to continue advocating for women's voting rights, but to point out more broadly how women could be directly engaged in social change and not be confined to traditional roles. And to that end, in 1870, in one of the magazine's very first editions, Julia wrote an article that was entitled An Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. It was a pacifist reaction to the carnage of the American Civil War and also the Franco-Prussian War being fought in Europe. The appeal was tied to Julia's conviction that women had a responsibility to shape their societies at a political level. It became known popularly as the Mother's Day Proclamation. Here's part of it. She wrote, "Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we've been able to teach them of charity and mercy and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own and it says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of counsel. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace." So in 1871, Julia presided over the Women's International Peace Association, and in 1872, partly in response to the huge positive reaction from her printed appeal, she proposed the national celebration of what she called a Mother's Day for Peace, to be held every year on June the 2nd. Now that effort was not successful, but 36 years later, the modern Mother's Day was established by Anna Jarvis, who named Julia as the inspiration. So the original idea for Mother's Day was for it to be an anti-war statement. In 1873, Julia organized the Association for the Advancement of Women to improve women's education and their entry into the professions that were usually reserved for men. In 1878, she was instrumental in introducing the 19th Amendment to Congress, guaranteeing women's voting rights. It was finally ratified 42 years later in 1920, making it illegal to deny the right to vote to any citizen based on gender. In 1889, the two women's suffrage groups that had split over the 15th Amendment 20 years earlier reunited as the National American Women's Suffrage Association with the singular goal of votes for women. Now, Julia died in 1910 at the age of 91. She did not live to see the 19th Amendment become law, but she never stopped working for peace, for civil rights, and for the cause of equal rights for women. And she never stopped being called crazy. At her memorial service in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over 4,000 people sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Her biography, published 6 years later, won the Pulitzer Prize. Crazy. Sometimes for good to prevail, for righteousness to be made real, it takes people, everyday people like you and me, to stand up for what we believe, for what's right, while others call us crazy. Today's passage from Mark tells a very similar story. After Jesus had spent time preaching and healing, he went back to his hometown of Nazareth for a visit. A large crowd had gathered, and Jesus was accused by some of the religious authorities of being in league with forces of evil. Mark tells us that when his family heard of it, they went out to restrain Jesus, for people were saying, he's gone out of his mind. One version of the Bible translates it, people were saying, he must be mad. But my favorite version is from the contemporary English version of the Bible, and it reads, when Jesus's family heard what he was doing, they thought he was crazy and went out to get him under control. So forgive me for putting it this way, but Jesus was and is crazy. And that means that we who follow him, we who call ourselves Christians, it means we're called and we're challenged to be just as crazy as Jesus. When we hear this story, we can sympathize with Jesus' mother and the rest of his family. They have good reason to be concerned because Jesus is going well out of bounds with his behavior. He associates with and he reaches out to help people considered unworthy and unclean. He says things like, blessed are the poor and the poor in spirit. Blessed are the merciful, the compassionate. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for God's righteousness. Blessed are those who work for peace. Blessed are you when you're persecuted for just trying to love and do what's good. That was crazy talk. He said, love your, not your friends, but your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who despitefully use you, who stab you in the back. That's crazy talk. He even prayed for the people who were executing him. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Now that's crazy. You know what, though? I think we need some craziness these days. I believe we need to be crazy enough to love like Jesus, to give like Jesus, to forgive like Jesus, to welcome everyone like Jesus, to not be satisfied with the old established ways of thinking about and practicing our faith, but instead to boldly do things in new ways like Jesus, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk with God like Jesus. Crazy enough to dare to change the world from the nightmare that it so often is into something that looks like the dream that God dreams for it. Crazy enough to challenge the voices and forces in our culture that seek to divide us, to try to force us into camps and categories that are polar extremes on social and political issues, into warring factions that refuse to reach out and even talk with each other constructively, but instead are expected to demonize each other as a purity test. So it might come as a shock, but I believe we're called to craziness. Now, it may not be obvious at first, but we actually have a day in which we remember crazy Christians, the first Sunday in November. It's called All Saints' Day. It is not called All the Same Day. It's All Saints' Day. Because although they were imperfect and mortal, just like the rest of us, when push came to shove, the people we honor as saints marched to the beat of a different drummer. In their lifetimes, they made a difference. They acted in ways that other people thought were crazy, in ways that reached beyond what the world considers sensible and safe. They gave, they sacrificed, they dreamed big, and they acted on their dreams. They believed in the impossible, and they made it possible. So let me get back to Julia Ward Howe. A woman of her era was supposed to write nice stories, not stories that would question the well-established roles of women in society. A proper woman was supposed to marry well, raise well-bred children, participate in a few charitable activities, and be fondly remembered by all those who knew her. That was the life she was supposed to have. Julia had been raised in a family that believed that following Jesus means changing things, changing the world for the better, and sometimes, maybe most of the time, that does mean marching to the beat of a different drummer. It means caring when it's tempting to care less, or standing up when others sit down. It means speaking up when others just keep quiet. It means being different, even being crazy. Back in 1997, I'm dating myself here. You might remember this. Apple aired a TV commercial during the Super Bowl broadcast just once. The tagline for the commercial and for the company back then was "Think Different." That's a weird phrase because it's grammatically incorrect. It should be "Think Differently." But being incorrect was part of the point. In the commercial, they showed a collage of photographs and film clips of people who had invented and inspired, created and sacrificed to improve the world, to make a difference. They showed Bob Dylan and Amelia Earhart, Frank Lloyd Wright, Maria Callas, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King Jr., Jim Henson, Albert Einstein, Mahatma Gandhi, and on and on and on. And as those images rolled by, a voice read this poem. Hear the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, you can disagree with them, you can glorify them or vilify them. About the only thing you cannot do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. So today I'm asking us to be crazy. Have a crazy faith. To be crazy enough to believe that this church can help change the world. You know, the truth is, being sane and safe and sanitized is killing Christianity. Blending in, never causing any waves, being comfortably part of the establishment. You know, that may have worked once upon a time, but it just won't carry the gospel anymore, my friends. Our world has changed dramatically from the days when mainline Christians like us represented the status quo. Today, now, people are looking to us, to you and me, to have the courage to stand up, to do what is right and what is just, to say no to ignorance and fear and disinformation, to say yes to respect and decency and collaboration to solve problems, and to treating all people as worthy. We need to be crazy Christians, like Julia Ward Howe, crazy enough to believe that God is real and that Jesus lives in what we say and do. Crazy enough to believe that the love of God is greater than all the powers of evil and death. Crazy enough to still believe, as Dr. Martin Luther King often said, that though the moral arc of the universe is wrong, it bends towards justice. We need to be crazy enough to believe that children don't have to go to bed hungry or be concerned for their safety at school. Crazy enough to believe that in our society, everyone is welcome, regardless of their nationality or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or gender identity. Crazy enough to believe that the world does not have to be the way it so often seems to be, devolving into tribalism and into labels. Because when you label anybody, that makes them a thing instead of a human being who is a valuable child of God. Crazy enough to believe that there is a way to lay down swords and shields down by the riverside. That is, the slaves used to sing, "There's plenty of good room in my Father's kingdom." Because every human being has been created in the image of God, and we are all equally children of God and meant to be treated as such.
Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make us holy, let us live to make all free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. God's truth is marching on.
And the people said, Amen.